Not business that business is. The business is to understand the different phrases where the common suffix is evidence. And I had told you that though the law of evidence, while defining evidence, recognizes only two categories, one that you call oral and the other that you call documentary. The other formal and informal varieties that you would be dealing with, and not only you would be dealing with, you are also expected to understand their meaning and their connotation. You are also expected to have an insight into their role, their value, and their use in the judicial proceedings. It's neither desirable nor it is possible to discuss in detail all those varieties, because some of those varieties, few of those varieties are self-explanatory and need no elaboration required. You use your common sense and you understand that what is meant by that particular variety of evidence. But then there are a few kinds, there are few varieties which require greater insight and greater elaboration. Even at this very juncture, even at the outset, so that you understand the other issues relating to admissibility, relating to relevancy, relating to the manner of production of evidence, and the value that has to be attached to a particular piece of evidence properly. So varieties such as substantive evidence, corroborative evidence, direct evidence, indirect evidence, hearsay evidence, real evidence, these are nowhere used in the 167 sections of Indian Evidence Act. But you would find these kinds, varieties mentioned and used in almost all the legal literature that you would be referring to, be it a textbook, be it a reference book, be it an article, be it a judicial decision. You would find that. And the questions that are attached to. I've already given you an example. In the context of CRPC, when you will be talking about FIR, one question that is often discussed and considered is that what is the evidentiary value of FIR? Or alternatively, whether FIR is a substantive evidence, or whether FIR is a mere corroborative evidence. And similar kind of questions vis-a-vis statements that are recorded by the police under section 161, that whether that is a corroborative evidence, and what is the evidentiary value of a statement recorded by the police under section 161, or for that matter the statement that is recorded by a magistrate under section 164. Which of the two statements of the same person would carry a greater weight? And by weight I mean greater value. And by value I mean that on which a greater reliance may be placed by the court in making its opinion about existence or non-existence of a fact which is relevant, including the fact in issue. So corroborative evidence, substantive evidence, direct evidence, indirect evidence, hearsay evidence, real evidence, and many other varieties. Presumptive evidence, for example. Many other varieties would be used in the judicial proceedings. And as and when you would be confronting these different varieties, you would be knowing that what kind of evidence we are talking about. And how is that different from the other? But as I already said that in spite of several such varieties being self-explanatory, a few require special attention and greater insight. And this is exactly what I am going to do. One of the most fundamental rules that may be said to be an overarching principle, all-encompassing, is what we call the best evidence rule. Best evidence. Grammatically, there is nothing better than the best. The best. Superlative. So what that rule is? The rule is that the party must produce the best evidence in support of his or her claim. Best evidence must be produced. And this is a common sense rule. If you have taken your dispute to the court, it means that you are serious about your rights. You are serious about your claims. Otherwise, there are other informal modes and methods and ways and means of resolution of disputes, especially civil disputes. So usually, normally, and this is especially true for the Indian society, that you take your disputes to the court, your civil disputes to the court, when all other means and modes and methods fail. And when you have taken a decision to take your dispute to the court, you must be ready to produce the best evidence in support of your assertion, in support of your claim. And if you fail, your claim would also fail. Let me give you an example. Suppose A entered into a contract with B, and now there is some kind of dispute between A and B regarding the terms of the contract, the terms of the agreement. Now it's not that the one who is aggrieved by the terms of the contract would be straight away knocking at the doors of a civil court for resolution of that dispute. Certainly he would be exploring other options, informal. I'm certainly not talking about arbitration and conciliation. Arbitration, conciliation is a legal mechanism. I'm not concerned with that. I'm concerned with non-judicial and non-legal, rather extra-legal modes and means. One could be that they are using the third person, the good offices of a third person, in whom they both have faith and trust, to resolve that dispute in an informal manner, beyond the contours of arbitration and conciliation law. Informal mediation. Informal mediation. But if that fails, and the plaintiff takes the matter to the court, making a certain claim, the plaintiff is expected to substantiate that claim with the best evidence. Best evidence. Now here, the dispute arose out of an agreement that was signed between A and B. So certainly the question would be that what are the terms of the agreement? What is the content of that document that A and B signed as an agreement? So how would that content be proved? The content must be proved by the best evidence. And what is the best evidence? The document itself is the best evidence. What if the document is lost? Would A be losing his or her claim as well as a consequence of that loss of document? That would be too harsh. And therefore, the law allows production of next best evidence. What would be the next best evidence? The next best evidence would be, for example, a photocopy of that. Photocopy of that. All this I am telling you without referring to any particular provision of the Indian Evidence Act, and certainly I will be drawing your attention to provisions of Indian Evidence Act as well, in order to substantiate the statements that I made in regard to how this rule of best evidence works in both civil and criminal cases. At the moment we are concerned with civil cases. Produce the photocopy. Produce any other document that the law permits as the next best evidence. But produce you must. Produce you must. And if you don't, certainly don't expect any favor from the court. Your claim may be genuine, but that claim has to be proved. And proved how? In the manner in which the law of evidence expects you to prove that claim. So you would find, and let me now start referring to the relevant provisions of Indian Evidence Act in order to substantiate and illustrate the best evidence rule. And to assert that how the best evidence rule is not rigid, is very flexible, But whether it is equally flexible in criminal trials is a question that we will be shortly dealing with. But let's refer to a few specific provisions in order to have a holistic understanding of this best evidence rule. Chapter 4 of Indian Evidence Act, which has only 2 provisions, is titled of Oral Evidences. And section 59 reads, and I'm quoting, all facts except contents of a document or electronic record may be proved by oral evidence. What does it say? It says all facts except contents of a document or electronic record may be proved by oral evidence. In other words, it says that all facts, physical or psychological, these are the 2 varieties we have yet not discussed and looked into the definition of fact as provided in section 3 itself of the Indian Evidence Act. But you know, physical facts and psychological facts, these are the 2 categories. All facts may be divided into these 2 categories. More on that when I'll be talking about fact. All facts except the content of a document by oral evidence. Doesn't that mean that content of a document can only be proved by documentary evidence? Isn't that the inference that you draw? By a bare reading of section 59. That is the inference that everyone would be drawing by a bare reading of section 59. But when you move to chapter number 5, titled of documentary evidence. Documentary evidence. You have this section 61 titled proof of contents of documents, reading, and I quote, contents of documents may be proved either by primary or secondary evidence. And then in the subsequent section 62, it is provided what is the meaning of primary evidence. In section 63 it is provided what is the meaning of secondary evidence, and let's have a look very quick. Not going into the details of that provision, or rather those provisions. Section 62 says that primary evidence is the document itself. What is the primary evidence? Document itself. What is the best evidence? The document itself. The agreement, the contract, in its original form, is the primary evidence. And content, if in dispute, may be proved by primary evidence, which is the document itself. Produce the document for the inspection of the court. You don't have the document in your possession. You have lost it. You destroyed it. Or it got destroyed. or the document on which you are basing your claim is in possession of the other party, the opposite party. If your claim is genuine, certainly the other party would not be willing to share the document, to produce the document, would keep denying that they have in their possession the original document. Would you lose your claim in such an eventuality? Would it be just? The answer is no. It's unjust. It's unreasonable that your genuine claim is lost because of a certain mistake that was made. So the law says that let's look at whether you have the next best. And this is exactly what Section 63 says. The next best would be, if you refer to clause 2 of Section 63, next best would be photocopy. There are many clauses. The easiest one I am referring to, the easiest one at this juncture, that would be easiest for you to understand. Photocopy of that document. Unfortunately, you don't even have photocopy of that document. Would that mean that you lose your claim, you lost it? How could you prove your claim when you neither have the original nor the photocopy nor an authenticated copy which the law permits? The law says next best. Bring the next best. And in spite of that embargo, which Section 59 apparently places. And what is that embargo? Let me refresh your memory again. Except contents of document or electronic record, all facts may be proved by oral evidence. Look at clause 5 of Section 63, where it's permissible to prove contents of a document by oral accounts of someone who had seen that document. Seen means not this, that you have seen this. Seen means who has perused. I showed it to you, but you have no idea what this document contains, whether it contains my notes, my briefs. Case law, citations, etc., etc. You can make a wild guess that because I am sitting with this document in a law of evidence class, it must be containing my notes. But your guess would be wrong. I don't prepare notes. So what the law says and what the law allows has to be understood in proper perspective. When it says that even content can be proved by oral accounts of those who have had an opportunity to see it, it means who have had an opportunity to peruse it. And who would be those people who would have an opportunity to peruse it? Different documents require different formalities for their authenticity, for their execution, for their registration. If A wants to enter into a contract with B, it is sufficient that both of them reduce the terms of contract into writing and sign it. Sign the document, one after the other. That's it. As a student of law of contract, you are aware that agreement may be oral, not necessarily written, but better that you reduce it into writing for convenience. No third person required by law as a witness to that agreement. If you have one, well and good. If you don't have, that's not going to affect the validity of that agreement. A and B enter into an agreement, formed a contract, signed the document, and also got it signed by an independent witness. That witness would be the person who would have an opportunity to peruse the contents. The law allows this third person to give his oral accounts about the content of that document. But as I said that, you are having the original document, but you are hiding it, and now you are trying to prove the content of the document by oral account of a person who had an opportunity to see it. Would that be allowed? The law says no, because best evidence must be produced. Best evidence must be produced. अब आप कहेंगे कि मैं हाइड कर रहा हूं तो कोर्ट को कैसे पता चलेगा? How would the court know that I am hiding? The court would know, certainly. The court would know because you have to prove before you are allowed to produce secondary evidence that you don't have primary evidence in possession. You don't have that in possession. Same holds good for wills as well. Wills by law require two witnesses, independent. So that document that you call a will would be signed not only by the maker of the will, but would also be signed by two independent witnesses. And who is going to sign a document without perusing the contents of that document? So certainly those witnesses, in case it is disputed, will or the contents of the will are disputed, certainly the two witnesses who had signed the will as witnesses would be allowed to testify. They would be allowed to testify. This is what the law allows. So it seems that the rule of best evidence is not that rigid as it originally seems, as it originally appears, but rather very flexible and allows for gradation of what would constitute the best evidence in the circumstances. So when we say that best evidence must be produced, best evidence must be produced, best evidence must be produced, the law allows only the best evidence to be produced. This rule has to be taken with a pinch of salt, because best evidence means best evidence in the circumstances. In the circumstances. And that's why you would find that in spite of that rigid rule which permits the court to consider and allow only direct evidence, there are certain exceptions to this rule whereby hearsay evidence is also allowed. Hearsay evidence, which certainly is not the direct evidence. But there may be a circumstance where the hearsay evidence is the best evidence available. There is no other evidence available. On the question of a particular fact and its proof. So how does it operate, and what are the consequences of this best evidence rule in a criminal trial? Looking at a 2015 decision would be sufficient to understand how does it work in a criminal trial, and then what are the consequences for the prosecution if the prosecution fails to adduce best evidence in the circumstances. Why only prosecution? Because prosecution has to prove the case, and that too beyond reasonable doubt. Plaintiff would also be required to prove his or her claim in a civil proceeding, in a civil suit. But that claim may be proved by preponderance of probability. This is what we know even before we started discussing law of evidence in a formal manner in this semester. But the burden on prosecution is more onerous, is heavier. And therefore it's important to see that what are the repercussions of the best evidence rule on prosecution's burden. And as I said, the best case would be that 2015 decision of the Supreme Court reported as Tommaso Bruno versus State of UP. Tommaso Bruno versus State of UP is a 2015 decision. (2015) 7 SEC 178. 2015 7 SEC 178. Tommaso Bruno and his female companion were charged with murder of their common friend who had joined them from Italy on a tour to India. Tommaso Bruno, his co-accused, a female, and the deceased, they had embarked on a tour of India, and after having spent few days at different places in India, they came to Benares and they checked in a budget hotel. Even the budget hotels are required to comply with certain directions and directives, and one of such directions and directives is that they must have CCTV cameras installed at all the vital locations within the premises of the hotel. For example, at the reception, at the entrance, at the exit, in the common lobby, etc., etc. This is very normal. So as would be the case with all the tourists, and another fact which is very important, Tommaso Bruno's alleged accomplice, and the deceased, they checked in a single room. They had booked only one room for themselves, and they had informed a day prior to the fateful day they had informed the management of the hotel that they would start their day by visiting ghats in Benares and all. And you know that mornings are the best for such kind of visits, early morning. So the story is that Tommaso Bruno and his female companion, they left for visiting the ghats, leaving the deceased back because he was uneasy, he was not feeling well. And after having spent few hours, they came back. They found their companion, the deceased, unconscious. They raised an alarm. Ambulance came. He was rushed to a hospital where he was declared brought dead. Tommaso Bruno and the other Italian lady, all three were Italian nationals. They were charged with murder. And not only charged, they were convicted by the trial court. And the conviction was confirmed by the High Court. And finally they appealed to the Supreme Court. The evidence against them was largely circumstantial. No one had seen Tommaso Bruno and the lady doing anything which would be resulting in death of the deceased. But there were circumstantial evidences. For example, they had the exclusive opportunity to cause death. And no one had seen them going out. Their explanation was that because they had left in the wee hours, very early, 4:35, when it was still dark and the staff was sleeping, certainly no one would be seeing them. But the CCTV cameras never sleep. They must catch you in whatever you are doing, especially when you are entering or exiting the premise of the hotel. When the matter reached the Supreme Court perused the whole document, all the evidences and all, and concluded that as the prosecution has failed to adduce the best evidence in the form of CCTV footage of the hotel where the alleged murder was committed, Tommaso Bruno and the lady must be acquitted. Now this acquittal may be attributed to some kind of faulty investigation, unprofessional manner in which investigation was carried out. But prosecution has to bear the brunt of such kind of faulty investigations, and for their failure to adduce the best evidence. And this decision that Tommaso Bruno and others must be given benefit of doubt was given in reference to Section 114 Clause G of Indian Evidence Act. Section 114 talks about certain presumptions of fact. The next topic that we are going to deal with would be presumptions of fact. There are two kinds of presumptions, as you would see: presumptions of law and presumptions of fact. I am ending this by quoting from Section 114G of Indian Evidence Act, which provides that the court can draw an adverse inference against a party that is in possession of best evidence and fails to adduce the same or withholds it from production, even if the burden of proving the fact did not lie on him. Prosecution has evidence of my innocence. Prosecution has a burden to prove my guilt. Prosecution is not burdened with proving my innocence, but it has evidence and it is hiding that evidence. Adverse inference would be drawn. And adverse inference would be drawn against the prosecution if the prosecution has in its possession the best evidence. You may argue that CCTV camera may not be working at that crucial time. No. The police officer who was in charge of investigation had even noted in the case diary that I have seen the footage. I have seen the footage. He saw the footage, but he did not produce that footage because he knew that that would weaken his case. It did not only weaken his case, it completely demolished his case. So you would find that you are under an obligation to produce the best evidence in your possession, irrespective of the fact whether the burden of proving that fact was on you or not. But this also should be remembered that this presumption is only a permissible inference. Permissible, meaning thereby it permits the court to draw this. It's not a necessary inference that in all cases this inference must be drawn, this adverse inference must be drawn. But you would find that in criminal cases, such kind of inferences are usually drawn where the prosecution seeks to hide the best evidence in the case. With this I end today's discussion, and we will continue with our discussion on how do we distinguish between direct evidence when used in relation to hearsay evidence and direct evidence when it is used in relation to circumstantial evidence. That would also be explaining, before we start looking into the theory of relevancy and what facts are relevant, the contours of hearsay evidence and also the rule relating to circumstantial evidence. This is the plan for the next class and maybe the next to next class as well.